Okay, this is 101, week 12, part 9. So he's talking about, this is a whole conversation about whether you should obey or not. And he wants you to pay attention to, the voice in he wants you to think about the difference between somebody outside you and your own internal voice. And then there's a lot of voices in you and which ones you should be listening to. Some of them were placed there by a brainwashing technique, which makes you want to, especially when young children learn from authority figures and they want to obey them their whole life no matter what. If you grew up thinking priests never make mistakes, when you're older, it's hard to imagine they could make a mistake. That's one of the reasons why the molestation scandal in the Catholic Church was so hard to discover, was because many of the people as children believed the priests didn't make mistakes and they were good. If you grew up believing priests are good people, it can be hard to believe when you grow up that they would do bad things. Same thing with cops. If you grow up believing cops are like really good and they're here to look out for you, it can be very difficult to be like, oh wow, they're bad. Because when you grow up with something, it kind of gets brainwashed a little bit. And then it's like, are you listening to the voice that people told you, or are you listening to your own actual voice? Or are you listening to a kind of brainwashing that came from as a kid? Cops are good, priests are good, priests are good. And it's something, you say that to kids enough, they get it in here. And then even though you have a voice inside you going, I don't think this cop is good, or I don't think this priest is good, it's hard to hear because there's another voice inside you that was put there by maybe your parents saying, priests are always good, cops are always good, and it's hard to figure out what to do or who to listen to. So in paragraph 12, this is the big paragraph at the bottom of page 3, talks about rational and irrational authority. So he wants to talk about what's worth listening to. So he says that an example of, I'm on the second sentence here of paragraph 12 at the bottom of page 3. An example of rational authority is to be found in the relationship between student and teacher. One of irrational authority in the relationship between slave and master. So that's a really simple example that makes it obvious. If somebody has enslaved you, they're telling you what to do, but they shouldn't. They're not giving you, the slave master is not giving the slave good advice. They want you to obey, but they don't want you to obey because it's good for you. They want you to obey because it's good for them. They're an irrational force and they're bad. So think about the difference between a slave master and a teacher telling a student what to do. The slave master tells the slave what to do, right? Not because it's good for the slave, because it's good for the master. But a teacher telling a student what to do, I'm not telling you what to do because it's good for me. I'm telling you what to do because I think it's good for you. I think if you listen to me, your college career is going to be easier. You're going to get, if you do what I tell you to do, I'm not saying it's not for my benefit. Okay, you listen to me, you don't listen to me, my life is the same. But I think if you listen to me, you're going to do better in college forever. If you take my advice and start assignments early and, give your opinion and back it up with reasons whenever you're asked for your opinion, back it up with reasons and examples, consider objections, quote things that are worth quoting. I'm telling you this not because it's good for me, because it's good for you. That is different from a slave and a master. Because when the master tells the slave to do something, he's saying, you do this because it's good for me, the man. And the slave goes, I don't think that's not safe for me. Master doesn't give a shit what's safe for you. He just wants the benefits of bossing you around. So that is the difference of who you should listen to and who you shouldn't listen to. Like, is the person bossing around because it's good for them, or are they an irrational authority not worth listening to, or are they a rational authority worth listening to? Okay. So an example of rational authority is to be found in the relationship between student and teacher, one of irrational authority in the relationship between slave and master. Both relationships are based on the fact that the authority of person in command is accepted, right? So in both cases, you've got a person who's bossing somebody else around. Dynamically, however, they are of a different nature. The interests, he's saying what I already said. The interests of the teacher and the student, in the ideal case, lie in the same direction. The teacher is satisfied if he succeeds in furthering the student. If he has failed to do so, the failure is his and the student's. The slave owner, on the other hand, wants to exploit the slave as much as possible. The more he gets out of him, the more satisfied he is. At the same time, the slave tries to defend as best he can his claims for a minimum of happiness. The interests of the slave, this is the crucial thing. The interests of the slave and master are antagonistic. See, the slave and the slave master are antagonistic. They don't get along. That's not a happy, healthy relationship. The teacher and the student want the same thing. You want to succeed in school, and I want you to succeed in school. But the slave and the slave master do not want the same thing. The slave wants to be free, and the master wants this guy to do work and not pay him. The interests of the slave and master are antagonistic because what is advantageous to the one is detrimental to the other, right? Meaning that the slave and the slave master don't get along because if the slave gets what he wants, the master's unhappy. And if the master gets what he wants, the slave is unhappy. But that's not true for student. In a student-teacher relationship, very different. If you get what you want, I love it. Whereas if the slave wants freedom, if the slave gets freedom, the master's pissed off, right? But you want to do well in school. Well, if you do well in school, I like that. I want you to do well in school. So our relationship is not antagonistic. I don't hate you. I want you. I want you to do well. But the slave wants to be free. The master does not want that. You want to do good in school? I do want that. I want that for you. So that's the difference between figuring out who you should obey and who you should not obey. The superiority of the one over the other has a different function in each case. In the first, meaning with teachers, in the first, it is the condition for the furtherance of the person subjected to the authority, and in the second is the condition for his exploitation. We already talked about this. This is simple. The vocabulary there is tricky, but I explained it already. Another distinction runs parallel to this. Rational authority is rational because the authority, whether it is held by a teacher or a captain of a ship giving orders in an emergency, acts in the name of reason, which being universal, I can accept without submitting. Irrational authority has to use force or suggestion because no one would let himself be exploited if he were free to prevent it. So irrational authority, like the slave and the master, it only works because of violence. The master's going to do violence. If the slave doesn't listen to him, the master will whip the slave or whatever. And it's based on irrational things like, I want what I want and I don't care what you want. But like if there's an emergency and the pilot tells me, put your seatbelt on and put your life vest on or whatever, I'm going to listen to that dude because he's giving me good advice. Like, he knows he's the expert. He knows the plane's about to go down, and the only way to save my life is to put a life vest on. Or he mentions the captain of a ship, right? If the ship is sinking, and the captain of the ship is like, you should get in the lifeboat, Jeff. I'm not going to be like, I will not obey you. I want to obey you, dude. That seems like a good idea to me. Because what he wants is also what I want, which is to save my life. But with the slave and the slave master, totally different. Because the slave master doesn't want the slave to have freedom. He wants, the slave master is being selfish and acting just for the slave master. Whereas the teacher or the captain of the ship in an emergency wants the same thing you do, which is for you to succeed, for you to live, for you to do good things. Cool, and that was paragraph 12. So the beginning of this is like a little difficult, but it gets much, much, much easier as you go. Okay, cool. We're doing good. All right. All right, now we head into, I'm at the top of page 4, looking at paragraph 13 here. This is where the essay gets, this is an interesting part of the essay, because this is really, I think, one of the most important questions he raises. He says that the first sentence of paragraph 13 at the top of page 4. Why is man so prone to obey, and why is it so difficult for him to disobey? It's a really good question. Why? It is true. It is, people say, oh, you should obey. You're talking about obedience and disobedience, but here's the thing that makes it tough. It's always easier to obey than disobey. It's just always easier. And people like to obey. That's one of the fucked up things about people. They really, and you may think, oh, they don't. He's going to give some examples. We'll think about it a little bit more. But really, most people, they're willing to obey. They like to obey. And disobedience is a hard road. Sometimes it's the right road for you, but it's tougher. Obeying is society makes it easier to obey than disobey. Of course it does, because the people in charge want you to obey. And if you do what they say, they reward you. And if you don't do what they say, they punish you. So of course, when you live in a society run by other people, it's going to be easier to just obey them because they will reward you. And if you disobey, you get in trouble. And this is anyway, we'll get more into this in the next video. Okay, let's stop here.